Yes, good morning everybody. My name's Craig. I'll be here in Ottawa and I'll be demonstrating to you the power of pivot tables in Excel. I'm going to be running a couple of little softwares, Excel mostly, but occasionally I'll run over to a PowerPoint session or perhaps a Notepad session. And without further ado, I'm going to get into an Excel session. So someone was nice enough to give me an Excel session sitting on my desktop. Trusting everybody sees my desktop, I'll be clicking on that. This presentation will run about 45 minutes, so somewhere around 10 to the hour I'll be stopping and possibly taking some answers to some of the questions that you guys come up with. So there's an Excel session. Everybody's probably familiar with Excel. 2007, 2010 is the new version that I'm currently running, 2010. And one of the highlights of 2010, whether you know it or not, I'm just going to take my cursor down the page and I'm going to accelerate to the very bottom of the page. And we now have 1 million rows of data available to us. So you can see in the bottom corner, I'm just slightly over 1 million, starting at row 1. I actually got quite excited when I saw 2007 and had 1 million rows of data. Earlier versions, 2003, 2002, 2000, I was limited to 65,000 rows of data. Now, why would I be talking so much about data? Pivots are all about managing data. So I'm going to go ahead and open a sample file that I've prepared ahead of time. This is a sample file that would be representative of some sales at a retail store. And I've already gone ahead and pinned that file. So I have it at the top of my listing here in 2010, and I see a couple of push pins indicating that I can easily get to these files if I want to get my hands on them. So here I am. I've opened up a data file. You'll please take note, row number 1 is special. Some of you may call this headers. Some of you might call it titles. I'm going to refer to them as field names. So these elements in row number 1, field names, category, supplier, company name is the purchaser buying these, country, unit price, quantity, and several other fields, including both text and numeric. And if you glance over here, I have a couple of columns. E and F, unit price and quantity, are the corresponding field names. This data was stored in a relational database, not in Excel originally, and as such, the people storing it in the relational database would never end up storing the calculated unit price times quantity. So that may be an issue to us, and we may have to improve that data as we move along. Other points of interest about the data that you're going to be turning into a pivot table. It needs to have repeating data, so things like seafood, 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 dairy products, dairy products, dairy products. You need data that has good, clean repetition in there. So column A, category, would be a good candidate for our pivot, as would column D, country, where I'm seeing Germany, 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 Mexico, Mexico, Mexico. So that's an important consideration in your data, is that the data has good quality repetitious data in one of the fields or more of the fields. Okay. You'll also note that on my environment I have only a single sheet. Normally you would know the default when you're dealing with an Excel document. There's normally 3 sheets, one called sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3. This one was called query 1, and again it was built by a product called Microsoft Access, and I allowed Microsoft Access to name the single sheet as it sent me this data out of its data store. I'm going to dive right in and demonstrate to you how simple pivots can be, yet how powerful. And as such, I'm going to just point out that it's going to be 5 mouse actions. I'm going to call it 5 clicks, although a couple of them are actually drag drops. And just I'll be counting these out loud as I go through to produce a pivot. And the idea of a pivot is so that you can take large amounts of data, and in my case, 2,156 rows of data minus 1 row. I don't count the field names in that data. So 2156 minus 1 row, that's 2155 rows of data. That'll be a cross-check number a bit later on for us, and we'll verify that that's how the data corresponds. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and simply produce this pivot table, which will analyze first by the category of commodity sold. So what it's going to do, it's going to count up how many seafoods, how many dairy products, how many beverages, etc., and analyze those. We should see a cross-check number at the end of 2155. So I'm going to start my click sequence. First click is to leave the Home tab and go to the Insert tab. In the Insert tab, I see groups such as the Symbols group, the Text group, the Links group, the Filters group, the Sparklets group, the Charts group, the Illustrations group, and the first group was the Tables group. And the first element of the two elements available in the Tables group is a pivot table. So the first click was Insert, second click Pivot Table, and I can now see a small dancing marquee. Looks like maybe a set of marching ants or something around the perimeter of my data. I can also read the data set as being sheet query 1 from absolute A1 down to absolute 2156 in column M. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And I'm about halfway through the process now, and as such, the system has added a new sheet to my Excel book. So as a consequence of adding in a pivot table, the default is to add a new sheet. Note at the bottom of my screen how I have the query 1 sheet, which had the original data, and I now have a new sheet called sheet 1. Also on that new sheet, I also have a list of all the fields. I have a list of all the fields available, and I see the field names that I had already previously established as being important to me, such as the country field, and I'm simply going to take the country field and drag drop it here down into one of the 4 boxes at the bottom, specifically the row labels box. Okay, so I'm just going to do a drag drop, and what it's done now, it's gone down through that data set, 2,156 rows, and found all the unique spellings in there. And for every unique spelling, it references one of those in my pivot table. Okay. If I had a different field I dragged in, so I'm just going to take the country field, which I've previously dropped into the row labels. I'm going to rip it away, just drop it off here in left field somewhere, and take the field I was talking about originally, which is the category field, and drag drop it in to the row labels. And now you can see how miraculously that same 2,155 rows of data has been analyzed to get me the unique spellings under that field called category. And this is the category of commodity that was sold. Okay. Some of you may recognize the data set. It comes from Microsoft's Northwind database. It's a famous database put into production about 25 years ago. Anybody who's read a book on relational databases has probably seen references to that. That's the data I'm using here. I also now take that same field, the category field, and I drag drop it into the second box at the bottom called sigma values. Sigma, the Greek letter, some people call it an E, some people call it an M on its side. Its official term is the sigma from the Greek alphabet, and most people would also think of that as the auto sum. I do not think of it that way, although in Excel most of us use it as the auto sum. It's a summary operation, and in this case it's a count. So what's happened here is the pivot table has taken our 2,156 rows minus 1 row, there's our cross-check number, and come up with how many of each flavor of transaction there were, by beverages, by condiments, by convections, by dairy, etc. Seafood down at the bottom. And that's my cross-check number coming from the original. Okay, I'm going to close out of this file. Saving changes, no. I'm going to reopen that file and just revisit the process a bit. So you need to get your hands on this data. I'll show you several ways today of getting your hands on the data. In the file I'm using, somebody had taken that data from Microsoft Access, a relational database, and exported it as an Excel file. This in fact is the old flavor of Excel. It's a what's known as compatibility mode. Just to let you know, you can do this with older versions such as 2003 or XP or 2000. You see how it says it's compatibility mode. And again, the importance here, having a field that has good quality data for repetition. Country would have been another good candidate. Okay. We also have a salesperson over here. Lots of repetition in there. The first name of the salesperson responsible. So column K, first name, would also be a good candidate. So once we had the data, you get your hands on that data. It may then be appropriate to improve that data. I'm going to try and improve mine here with a right-click, insert, and I'm going to put in a word like total. That's a new field I'm just adding. And I'm going to make an assumption that if you are an Excel user, it would not be anything special for you to do a calculation in here of equals the quantity times the unit price. This would give me a line item total. And there's the first line item total in G2. And I could just simply fill that down. You either know about the fill handle in Excel or you don't. You might drag drop it, or you might know that in a data set like this you can simply double click and it fills all the way down. I should go and verify that I made it to the bottom. Yes, I did, 2156, and I now have those line items all the way down. I do notice that I have the column is not quite wide enough. There's an entry here at line 27, and I'm just going to best fit that column. So I've made one improvement to this data set. Not unusual to do things like that as you get your hands on the data. And then again, only 5 mouse actions to turn this raw data. So I'm going to refer to this as raw data, and I'm going to turn it into a pivot table. So the mouse clicks for the process were leave the Home tab and go to the Insert tab. In the Insert tab, the group called Tables, first one on the left, 2 options in there, and I'm interested in the first one called the Pivot Table. And as I click on that, Microsoft gives me a dialog box suggesting the range I might be interested in, and they predetermine that as Query 1, that's the name of the sheet, Bang, exclamation mark. I'm not sure why they called it Bang. That's the name they give the separator between the sheet name and the cell range, and it's from A1 down to N. Note how last time it was at M, as in Mike, now it's N as in November, and that's because I added a new column in, formerly at the position G, which pushed everything over to the right, making our final column N instead of M, as in Mike. And OK to that. And then it was 2 drag drops, one from the repeating field of category, and there's all my unique categories out of those 2,000 plus records. I could rip that one away if I wanted to and see things like the salesperson, which was the first name field, and rip that one away perhaps, and take one of the others that has good repetition, such as the country. Now in this country, I have a little bit of a concern that I'm seeing most of the countries spelt in full English, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, France, but a couple of them with short form acronyms, UK, USA. So I might be concerned that we weren't spelling things under the same model. So it would be something to look out for if you were dealing with provinces and somebody was spelling Quebec out in full, others were spelling Quebec as QC, others were spelling it as QUE or PQ if the case may be. So I would be concerned and interested in verifying that the spellings were consistent. Okay, and so the system then, when I asked to add a pivot table, automatically added a new sheet and presented to me a list of all the field names. It's then my responsibility to simply go and grab one of the fields and drag drop it into the row labels. Once I've done that, that's a 4th click, fourth mouse action, then turn around and drag the same field into the sigma values. And so again, I'm calling it sigma values, not sum values. So I see sigma as a summary operation, which could be an average, a standard deviation, a sum, or a count. And the default, if I drop a text field in there, is a count. And I can now see the breakdown of sales by country. So this is kind of interesting. I'm seeing that both Poland and Norway had 16 transactions associated with them. This is 3 years worth of data. I haven't yet analyzed it by any kind of a time frame. just by some textual value such as Canada, Canada, Mexico, Mexico, something like that. And so it's counting up how many Norways, how many Polands, how many Canadas. Well, for further investigation, a pivot table allows me to do something called a drill down. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do a drill down here in a minute. And what that'll do is display these 16 Norwegian transactions on their own sheet. Again, I'm just going to close out complete. I'm actually going to start a session of PowerPoint. And so here's a little PowerPoint presentation documenting very briefly the 4 steps associated with a pivot. So step 1, get your hands on the data. Get your hands on the data. So far I've used the same file over and over. It's called data list sales, and all it is an Excel extract from some other system. So whether you're using PeopleSoft or Great Plains Financial, most of those systems know how to take their data and spit it out as a .xls or XLSX. I was using the old flavor, XLS, as opposed to the new and improved XLSX, just to demonstrate that you could. So get your hands on the data. I'll also be showing you how to do that from a Microsoft Access database, and I'll show you how to do that through an acronym called SQL, pronounced SQL. So we'll be looking at other ways of getting your hands on the data later on. Then you might choose to improve the data. And I chose to improve the data with a new column, so I right-clicked and added a new column. I then added a calculation, the unit price times the quantity, to come up with a line item total. Okay. Then I passed that through the pivot table, and I'll be going back and doing that. Then you have to decide how you're going to distribute that information or present that information to your users, and there'll be a lot of different choices in there. So those are the 4 steps. Get your hands on the data. I'm just using a simple Excel, and that Excel needs to have good, clean data with the same spelling for each intended item. An example that I don't have in my data set might be your province, and some people spell provinces with 3-letter codes such as ONT. Some people do it with 2-letter codes such as QC, and some people do it in full English and others do it in complete French. So you want to have consistency in those type of entries, and that is a key to good pivoting, is having consistent, clean data with good repetition in at least a couple of the fields. Improve your data, pass it through a pivot table, and then present your data to whoever is going to be looking at it. So I'm going to just head back to the Excel environment. I'm going to get back into my file, data list sales. Again, the pinability makes it very easy for me to get in there. Again, I chose to improve my data. I'm going to spell it slightly differently this time, LI_total. And LI_ stands for me as line item total. I'm going to assume everybody knows how to do a calculated field such as equals unit price times quantity. Last time I did it quantity times unit price. When you're doing multiplication, that wouldn't make any difference which order those are in. If it was subtraction or division, the order would be paramount of importance, and an enter, and then a double click to fill down. I do have a hidden column here because the entry in there became too wide, and as I double click to best fit that, I'm ready to go. So it was 1 click, 2 clicks. Verify please that you do have the dancing marquee around your data set. Also, you can read it from inside here. And I'm going to simply say OK to that. That developed a new sheet for me. And on that sheet, I see the field names. If I was not part of the pivot right now, so I'm over in some other cell in the middle of the sheet, I lose those field names. That's important as well. You may be concerned that you think you've lost your pivot. Just click back anywhere in the pivot area as opposed to outside of the pivot area. So outside the pivot area you don't see anything, be back in the pivot and then pick your field, 4 mouse actions, and the same field in the sigma values. I'll explain later why you put the same field in the sigma values. For now we're just going to accept that. And again, I see these numbers with the corresponding cross check at the bottom of my listing. 21.55. I did talk about the possibility of a drill down. So I see the Norwegians having 16 transactions. Note please at the bottom of my sheet, I had the sheet 1, and adjacent to sheet 1 I also had query 1, which was the original raw data. And now as I take my mouse and double click on the 16 of Norway, lo and behold, I've got the 16 Norwegian transactions on a new sheet. See how these are the same 16 transactions we saw as a summarized data set back on sheet 1. I have to know how to navigate back to sheet 1 in case I was going to continue doing this drill down technique, and I might be interested in the Canada 75. And again, a double click on that numeric value, and there's the new sheet with the 75 Canadas on their own clean sheet. Okay. So this is not a new technology. It's not new to 2010. You had it available in 2007. Oh, by the way, you also had it available and still have it available in the old 2003 and back in XP, which is known as 2002, 2009-7, and as early as version 5 of Excel. So it's been floating around here for about 25 years. Nothing too new here. Okay. I took the liberty of generating up a couple of help calls. I teach a lot of different softwares. Excel is one software. Pivots within Excel is one facet of the software I teach. Charts within Excel is a different facet. I teach about 250 softwares, so I teach a lot of softwares. I live and I die by the help files. Not everybody has bought into the help files. I know if you hunt enough, you'll find good references. I took a couple of those references out of the environment. This was an F1 help, and I threw in the word pivot, and these were some of the topics that came up based on that F1 help from my pivot. In there, I drilled into things like a quick start, how to create a pivot table report. Okay. I'm just going to increase the size of that. So they're talking about getting your hands on a data source, a source of data. And in this case, it was from a worksheet. And they have it as item number 1, where they have column A, sports, golf, golf, tennis, 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 golf. B, which quarter it was, QRT1, QRT3, QRT4, QRT1. Good repetition in there. Okay. And then their pivot, they threw the sport in the row, and look at what they've done here. They threw a different variable, the quarter, up in the column. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can mimic that. So I have something in the row. I also had a field, if I go back to my query 1, I had a field way over here, column K, ship via. What was the shipping company involved? And this was very coarsely separated data. It turns out Speedy Express, Federal Shipping, and United Package were the only 3 choices available. So as such, that makes an excellent candidate to pull the ship via down and into the column label. And look at what just happened to my pivot. Okay, when ship via wasn't there, it just gave me the counts against the countries. Note the 75 for Canada. But if I drag in another field into the column labels, particularly one that's coarsely aggregated, such as 5 or less, and in my case only 3, I now see that those 75 transactions are broken down this way. 39 for the first shipping company called Federal Shipping, only 9 for Speedy Express, and 27 for United Package. Okay? And those again would tally up to the grand total going across. Now what I have is I can either double click on the 75 to see all the Canadian orders, or double click only on the Canadian orders carried by Speedy Express, and what happens with the double click? That's right, a new sheet with only those 9 transactions by Speedy Express. Okay. Again, I would have to keep track of where my pivot was back on sheet 1 and be ready to navigate back to that location. Okay. So quite interesting horsepower available to us. I'll just close out of that again. Saving changes, no. Reopening it from my recently used. And from this raw data, which I'm probably going to improve, 5 clicks away, 1 click, 2 clicks, note the dancing marquee and say OK, 3 clicks, a drag drop of something with repetition into the row labels. There's all our salespeople, and a drag drop of the same field into the sigma values. Okay. If I have another parameter, such as the ship via, I could drag drop that into the column labels and get what would be known in the industry as cross tabulation. Something in the row, something in the column, and a cross tabulation of the data between those. Okay. Note how Margaret, if I was to sort this very quickly, Margaret was our best salesperson, and she seems to have a favoritism towards United Package for some reason, where not double, but a significant amount greater for that other value. Now, the word pivot comes from the idea of moving from the column to the row. So I'm going to strong side the row labels and put 2 values down there. First name, and then under first name, I'm going to simply drag drop the ship via, or put the first name under to get a completely different representation of the same information, or pivot it back up to the column. So that's a bit on the bare bones pivots. And again, I'm going to just return back to the original data source, the entire pivot report, which is down here, and potentially they're using a summarization of the sales. Okay, I did not use the numeric data of line item total or total. I used a textual value in my sigma values. I'm now going to go and demonstrate that if I use the numeric. Keep in mind, of course, that Excel only knows about 2 types of data, text or numbers. So you can have millions of rows and columns of data in an Excel. All of them are one of 2 flavors. They're either text or they're numeric. That's a nice thing to keep in mind, and it may cue you in a bit to what you put in the sigma values. So I'm going to go ahead and implement that. So I'm back in here. I'll just, I won't close the file, I'll just destroy out my existing pivot. It is a recommendation by Microsoft, and I concur with their recommendation to have 1 pivot per book. 1 pivot per book. Okay, so I see lots of people who don't heed that recommendation. They put 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 different pivots in the same book, and then they complain about slowness in the system, and they seems bloated and hard to manage. Of course, if you're managing 1,000,000 rows multiple times, that could slow things down a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and put a calculated field in here. Insert. Just as an FYI, I have currently broken my database. I am not allowed to have blanks in row 1. The field names are very important. They're critical to this operation, and I have just broken that by not having text in G1. If I was to spell it XXX, that's perfect. The system is happy again. I now have a field called XXX. A better name would have been LI_total, line item total, which was unit price times quantity, or quantity times unit price. Double click fill down. And I now have valid numeric data that would make sense. Some numeric data doesn't make sense. Things like a check number, or an order number, or a PRI, or an employee ID, they are numeric values, but they don't work well in terms of mathematics. If I have a check number, this one's an order number, but if I had a check number, number 582, that does not mean 582 units or dollars or anything like that. It's just a number to keep track of which piece of paper I'm talking about. So be careful when you're using numeric data. Things like a line item total, perfect to go into our pivot as well. Up to this point, I have not used that. I have simply had the system take things like seafood, seafood 2, seafood 3, and count how many seafoods. That's why you use the same field. Insert pivot OK, there's the unique spellings within the system. Same field in the sigma, it counts how many seafoods, how many meat and poultries, how many dairy products. Okay, so if you put a textual field in there, it counts. And with that, we get this very useful cross-check number. I'm almost paperless. I might print 2 or 3 sheets of paper a month if somebody's requested it of me. Normally I'm paperless. However, I do keep a scrap of paper and pen around, and I jot down record counts. 2156 minus 1, 2155, so I know I'm not missing any records. Okay, so that was a bit important that you have that cross-check number in the corner. You only get that, of course, if you're counting. Now, if instead of putting the category in there, watch what happens as I drag drop in my line item total, which was the unit price times the quantity. It changes the operator to give me a sum. So drop a text field in there, and it counts. Drop a numeric field in there, and it assumes to sum. And so now I see the dollars brought in by each of those commodity types. So that was an important difference as to which field you bring into the sigma values box. Bring a text field into the sigma values, and it will count. Bring a numeric field, but it has to be a valid numeric field, such as a line item total, or I had originally called it XXX, any name you want to give it, usually something with more meaning than an XXX or an ABC, and it will assume to sum it. Okay, very powerful. And again, if I was to drag drop in a coarsely divided field, I can see the breakdown of transactions carried by the shippers as well. Okay. Now I did format that data as currency. If I was to rip away again the sum of and drag drop in a text field again, it still looks like currency, and I would have to change that to, say, comma, to show me how many units without the currency symbol. Okay. So that's the hows and the whys. If you throw a text field in, it counts. If you throw a numeric field, now I'm going to throw the order ID, which is not a valid field. Remember what the order ID was? It was just an incrementing number as to which piece of paper we were filling in terms of, let me take your order, please, and then the line items within that order. So they range around 10,000. And if I was to accidentally take that and drag drop it into sigma values, I do get data, but it's nonsense. It has no meaning. So you've got to be very careful about what field, particularly numeric ones, that go into the sigma values. Okay. And I'm not going to save that. I am going to do some significant improvements to my data set this time. So that was in our PowerPoint. Getting your hands on the data. As soon as I finish this little demonstration of the improvements and doing something with those improvements, I will go and get data several different other ways, including SQL, structured query language. Excel's had an integrated SQL generator built into it for about 25 years as well. We will improve the data by other calculations, including some date-time calculations, and then we will pass some of those through the pivot as well. Okay. So this is the easiest one, where I'm going to do my total. I'll go back to the spelling of total. Equals this times this. Fill it down. I'm also going to add several other calculations, and this one I'm going to insert what year. And I'm going to use one of the built-in or intrinsic functions, the year function. So most people who are in Excel already know about the sum function. You might know about the average function. There are about 600 functions in here. I'm going to be using the year function, which returns a 4-digit integer of a date. I'm going to hit the tab key, and Microsoft now tells me that it needs a serial underscore number. Through experience, I've found out that every time Microsoft says it needs a serial underscore number, their programmers were telling me that was the argument that the year function needed. What they really meant to say was I need a date, give me a date. And so I'm going to feed it in the order date here, which is a serial underscore number. And I'm going to pick up the format of an adjacent cell, paint it on, and there's 1998. So regardless of what month it is, what day of the month, it's just extracting the year component. And as I double click that, I can see there are 3 years, 96, 97, and 98 in here. So part of the strategy you might want to implement is not have a separate book for 2013 and a separate book for 2012 and a separate book or separate sheet for 2011. Have them all stacked one under the other, just with a date field, so we can differentiate that way. Now that I have a new field called the what year, I might add another one in here called the month code, and another function equals the MONTH, and it's going to return a number between 1 for January and 12 for December. I'm going to complete that with a tab. And it also wants a serial underscore number, and there's a number 4 representing April, and other numbers as I fill them down. So I now have 3 calculated fields here, the total, the what year, and the month code, and I'm going to go ahead and produce my pivot. So don't forget, get your hands on the data, potentially improve your data through calculations. You may also improve it through finding inconsistencies in the way people spell things, like USA, U period, S period, A period, the States, United States of America, etc. So you'd want to make sure the data was good and clean. So I've finished my improvement. I'm now going to crush it through that pivot and get some meaningful data out of it. Insert, pivot, OK, drag drop, drag drop, potentially done at that point. But now as I take things like what year, I can now see the breakdown of these transactions from 96, 97, and 98. And I may see trends across that as well. Rip away the category, drag in the first name, see the breakdown by the sales staff by year, rip away the first name, drag drop in the country, and you see how quickly I can reanalyze information by some other parameter. And again, no problem to do the what year above the country in the row, or the what year below the country, or back up in the column labels. That's the pivot part. That's where the word pivot comes from. And in fact, I don't know whether you noticed or not, when you saw the icon associated with the pivot, they're showing me the row and the column and a little arrow set of arrowheads between the two of them. Okay. I'm going to take that picture, and I'm just tapping the print screen on my keyboard. That just took a picture of my screen, which I'm going to then drop off in Paint. Hopefully some of you know about Paint. It's a little pixel editor. It's on every Windows system. And within that, I'm just going to make a little pictogram for you that may make it easier to understand what is important within that pivot environment. So I'm taking all of this data and presenting it to you in a way that would be perhaps a bit easier to understand. I'm just going to make some red boxes here, such as the category, and some lines, such as drop that into the row labels. Perhaps I'll just redo that to the country, because that's the one I actually have in there. So take a field that has good repetition, Canada, Canada, Mexico, Mexico, Canada, Canada, drop it in the row labels. Take the same field and drop it in the sigma values. By default, it will count. If you want to, take a different field, such as the what year, drop it into the column labels. And as such, that's a reasonably quick way of identifying the important parts of the pivot table field list environment. Okay. Now, some of you would be clicking instead, you'd be adding checkboxes. That would have been fine as well. It's a recommendation to do the drag drop, particularly because of the sigma values. Okay. And if you put a text field in the sigma values, the system will count Canada, 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 Mexico, Mexico. It will count how many of each text item. Put a numeric field in there, and you would, by default, get a sum value. So that picture might be important. I'll go so far as to save it and call it pivot. And I could call that back anytime we needed to go and take a look at it. And don't forget, of course, about the double click drill down to get the, in this case, 7 transactions for Denmark in 1998 on a clean sheet. Okay, so that's bare bones pivots. I'm just going to flip back to some of my helps. So originally I had done a help. You could do the same thing on your system, whether that be 2010, 2007, 2003. All of them support help, F1. Throw in the keyword pivot, and it will come up with a bunch of topics. Some of those would even be videos. Some are from spreadsheets, about.com. Some would be from eHow. Some are from Microsoft. So there's a lot of different choices in there. I had gone and seen a bit on some of these pivots, and they had pictures in here on the Insert tab Tables Group Pivot, and I had the pivots table dialog box. By default, it understood what my data range was. It recognized my data range as long as your field 1, your row 1, is special, and that can be made special several different ways. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then they drag dropped in a couple of elements into the row labels and a numeric into the sigma values, which in their case did a sum. Okay. I had not mentioned, some of you may have noticed, that when I was in a pivot, I also then got pivot tools. If I was outside of my pivot, I lost them. If I was back in it, I got them, including options and designs. Okay. You could go and investigate some of those if you had an interest in it. I had demonstrated at one point sorting by the grand total of the country, so I could get my most important countries up to the top of the listing. Okay. Now, in this case, in my columns, I had 3 entries. Look what would have happened if we had not heeded that warning and put something very coarse up there. By putting the country up there, it almost scrolls off screen. And in fact, it does a little bit. So the item you choose to put in the column labels, if you even choose to use it, should be very coarse, like 2, 3, or 4 choices. If I had 25 choices, probably not a good candidate to go in column. Works very well in the row, but not in the column. Okay. I'm just going to make a new file here, and I'll demonstrate getting my hands on data from somewhere else. So again, I just used the keyboard shortcut to do that, Control+N. Control-N is in November. That made a new document. And I'm going to go and use a technique under the Data tab from other sources, and I can go and build a query, also known as SQL. I'm going to pick it up from Microsoft Access Database, and OK. And I can now browse to whatever location I would like, wherever I'm going to pick up my data from. Note the ancient nature of the browse dialog box. This is developed back in Windows 3.1, so that's how old this technology is, Windows 3.1 based. And these are now all of my tables and queries over in an Access database. So you can use this technique against any ODBC-based data set. I'm going to go and pick up the orders and move over all the fields and maybe move back the amount of freight associated with it and perhaps move back the ship region. Other than that, I had all of the data. I am going to take 2 seconds to stop off in the little software that's generating this query called Microsoft Query. And there's the SQL statement that was generated during this sequence of clicks. So that would be a little bit outside the scope, but just to let you know that yes, you can go and connect to outside systems very effectively, and then return that data to an Excel session. This one has 831 minus 1, so 830 is my new cross-check number, and I'm going to do it against the ship country, which looks like the only one that would be really reasonable to accomplish this. Insert, pivot, OK, and I'm going to take the ship country, drop it in the row, and the ship country, remember it was 830, and sure enough there's the 830 transactions by any given country. Okay, so we're down to about 10.2. That's probably about where we're going to stop. I'll go and take a look and see whether we have any questions lined up. I can find our WebEx. Oh, there we go. And looking for our, how come I'm not seeing that? Sorry about that. I'm trying to find our WebEx.
Craig, it's Laura. There's just a few questions in there about if the session is being recorded and if we will share the URL.
Okay. I'm not seeing my WebEx to get at those questions right now.
Okay, yeah. So for everybody, the session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. Again, from the events page, you can go to past events, but we will also send everybody an email with that link as well. And I don't see any Excel-specific, pivot table-specific questions at the moment.
You don't have any questions?
Not Excel pivot table-specific right now. So if people have questions, fire away.
So will we use the last 9 minutes here for any of those questions, or do you want me to keep going on a presentation?
There's one question here. Can you use data from multiple sheets?
You can, but it's recommended not to. And in fact, you would have had to have memorized the old path sequence to get into it. I'm going to demonstrate that. You can't get at it without having a resilient memory back to 2003. So I'm going to just tap my Alt key in my Excel session. Alt. It used to be under D for data and under P for pivots. This is the old pivot chart wizard, and you were allowed to consolidate from multiple ranges. It's not recommended. In fact, Microsoft doesn't even allow you to do it anymore unless you either have a license for 2003 or earlier, or remember the keyboard shortcuts to get to this. So it's recommended that if, say as an example, I had the Canada data on sheet 1 and the USA data on sheet 2 and Mexico data on sheet 3, to copy and paste those other two sheets under Canada, without the field names of course, and then simply have a new column called what country and populate the first group with Canada, the second group with USA, third group with Mexico. So it's recommended not to do that, but it's possible.
Another couple questions here. What are the report filter fields used for?
Okay, I'm just going to go back into my data set here. I'm going to add in, I'll go into one that has more parameters available. So I'll go back into my data list sales. And instead of the what year in the column, I'm going to drop it in the report filter, and I'll put the month code in there as well, and maybe the supplier in there as well. And so what I have now, even if this little pivot fields list is closed, I've actually closed it, I can now take things like the what year and simply drag drop it from there down, or take it from there and drag it back up. I can also apply filters to say, no, I don't want to see everybody, I only want to see Bigfoot Breweries and Forêt d'Érable out of all that listing. And so I drop away down in my possibilities, and note how the funnel appears now to be in effect. I can also do that directly from the row elements. I'm going to do just the North Americans, which would be Canada, Mexico, and USA. And again, I'm now down to a subset of my 2155 of only 499. That would now possibly make a good candidate, because I only have 3 choices, to go in here, and some other item to go down the side, and I can see those breakdowns across North America. So filtering is a capability, whether I do it in here or up in the report filter area.
Yeah, I've got another question here. Size, count, or sum of values, is there a way to simply display text values, possibly unique values, once the row and column labels are identified?
When you put a numeric field in there, such as the line item total, which I had previously calculated as unit price times quantity, I'm then able to do other operators, such as the count, the average. So there's my averages against those countries by commodity type. I can switch that to be the highest, which is known as the max, or the lowest, which is known as the min, or some other calculation. There is also a possibility of doing full-blown calculations in the show as. I got there by aiming carefully at the element that was in sigma values and clicking on the value field settings and picking the one I wanted out of the list. Okay. Now, the default is to do a sum of numerics, and the default is to do a count of text. But you can adjust those, including calculations.
Okay, do you have time for another question?
Yep.
If I have a number field that I really do want in the sigma values, can I somehow change the operation to a count of those values? Example, count of items by order number.
Yes, I'm going to do a what would normally be referred to as dollars and docs. So these were the dollars, and I'm going to go ahead and add a text field in there above or below it, and these would be the counts. Okay, these ones would need to get changed to be a different format. So I can see there were 404 transactions in beverages for a total of this amount of dollars. And I can see there were 330 seafoods for a total of this amount of dollars. So simply adding 2 fields into the sigma values, and you can get your data that way. Maybe 2 more questions?
Okay, there's one more question here.
Okay.
Any tips on the report filter box part of the pivot table menu?
What was that again, please? About the report filter box?
Yeah, of the pivot table menu. Any tips on that box, I guess?
I tend not to use it a whole lot because the filtering is so good right out of the rows and the columns. But sure, it's an easy way to leave stuff that you can then drag drop in if you would like, particularly if you choose to eliminate the fields list box on the side, or if it gets closed accidentally or something like that. One thing I did not point out to you is the idea that of this data, you can then turn around very quickly and produce things like a pie chart based on that data. So there's a pie chart of that meaningful information based on the commodity types. And if I was trying to present something, I could then identify, say, meat and poultry as being our lowest or one of the low values, or something like beverages being one of the higher values. So this data is nearly meaningless, but holds the key to lots of information. Pass it through a pivot table, and then present that data to whoever you'd like to present it to. Okay, so as a quick follow-up, pivots are a great way of analyzing deep data sets, and in fact we can now go up to 1 million rows of data in the new 2007, 2010 environment, 2013 of course as well. You can improve the data through calculations. There's lots of other ways of improving it. We could have VLOOKUPs that would convert chunks of things into new data. Passing it through the pivot is not nearly as intimidating as you probably thought it was. The pivot is relatively easy. It was only 5 drag drops to get the base pivot going. Double clicking for drill downs, etc. You have to decide how you're going to present that data, whether it's going to be through bar graphs and pie charts and that kind of stuff, whether you're going to move the data over, copy paste to PowerPoint or Word for the presentation, save it as a PDF, save it as a web. Lots of options in there. So that's a good start for you. You should be able to get off and start attacking these things a little bit. You do have to understand your data reasonably well. What's got good repetition in it? What will make a good candidate for the row? If I have numeric data, is it valid numeric data that could be useful in the sigma values box? And the possibility, of course, of charting that data, etc. So I'm going to hand it back over to Laura. We were supposed to be done at 1 o'clock, and thanks very much.